This is Manchester. It's a modern city with a big history. It's one of the most popular cities to live in Britain actually. House prices here are soaring well above the national average when it comes to growth. It's growing faster than most other places in the country. It's cool, it's popular, it's got an international reputation, famous sites, world-class sports facilities, and these days its skyline is the tallest it's ever been, its footprint wider than ever before. All except this bit here. That's not Manchester. That's an entirely different city altogether. And in case you're not from round here and don't understand why two cities sit right up against each other, you're not alone. Many people from outside the area and even many from within don't realise that this, Salford, is a city at all. So what would happen if we forced these two to become one? Testing. Oh god, here we go. Manchester is one of Britain's biggest and most important cities, both economically and historically. From space, it's just a huge circle, but in fact, the area of its council boundary is this weird kind of elongated shape. There's a North Manchester taken in places like Harper Hay and Cheetham Hill. There's an East Manchester taken in places like Gorton and Clayton and Openshaw. And there's a South Manchester taken in places like Chorlton and Didsbury and places like that. But there's no West Manchester. And the reason is if you leave the city centre and head west, you don't enter a set of neighbourhoods of diminishing density, but you enter a completely different city centre altogether. And this, if you're not familiar with the area, is Salford. A city in its own right, with its own crest, its own council, its own bin collections, everything. Salford and Manchester are very rare examples of twin cities that exist right next to each other. Not the more common twin city case that can be found all over the world, where two nearby cities begin to merge into one as they grow over time. But two city centres that have grown on opposite sides of the same river, like two single-celled organisms that have evolved separately in the same petri dish. But culturally, economically, socially and historically, Manchester and Salford share so much, it's easy for outsiders to forget that the latter even exists as a separate city. Some even think Salford is a district of Manchester. And if you look very quickly at Salford as a place, you see that not only is the city centre stuck right next to Manchester's, but that it pretty much completes that circle shape that Manchester has, wedging in there quite nicely. It doesn't have its own independent circle of influence. And other things about it also seem to serve this pattern. Trunk roads lead through Salford to get to Manchester. It doesn't have its own ring road, unlike Manchester, whose ring road blasts through the middle of Salford anyway. Light industry, big retail parks and warehouses all clutter the middle of Salford at a distance from Manchester that echoes other parts of the latter city. It seems that actually, since long before Salford was even given city status in 1926, 73 years after Manchester, it was already being designed and laid out to be a nice slice of Manchester's pie, not a pie of its own. So it looks like the biggest secret in Salford that no one is allowed to talk about is that maybe someone made a mistake. Maybe Salford is a city in name only. So why didn't the two cities ever merge? Why is one much more dominant than the other? And is it about time we all just had done with it and stopped pretending that Salford isn't Manchester? Well, no, of course not. Of course, before you get all angry in the comments, of course the answer to that question is no. But it's interesting, isn't it? And what I want to do in this video is look at the good things and the bad things about formally merging these two cities. So, the first question to answer is why Manchester and not Salford? So when the Romans first came to the area in 79 CE, they chose the bendy curves of the River Medlock for their fort rather than going near where the locals were, up here at the confluence of the River Irk and the River Irwell. This was all very green, very fertile riverland in ancient times, so there were tiny Brittonic settlements all over the Irwell Valley and beyond. But when the Romans left, locals didn't take over the fort and vicus, but scoured it for building materials and essentially let it rot. This settlement here, at a ford across the river, slowly began to grow. Now you might think that the Romans picking this side of the river set the tone for Manchester becoming more important over time, but it's hard to really say. For centuries afterwards, this was all just kind of one area, small settlements of a diverse group of people. And it all started to change in the Dark Ages thanks to the slow push northward by the House of Wessex, first under Edward and then Aethelstan, to absorb Northumbria into a greater Angleland of church-building Christians. Not only did they absorb all this land into a kingdom centred all the way down here in the south, but they also first recorded the name Salford, or Salford, or Ford by the Willows. Why they decided that this bank of the river should be separate to whatever was over here already remains unknown, but they did. The Anglo-Saxons split the region up into areas known as hundreds, and the 350 square mile area land here was centred around Salford. For a brief period then, Salford had administrative control over Manchester, as well as a huge area surrounding. It perhaps would have stayed that way for centuries, and who knows, perhaps even to this day, this could have been one of them sliding door moments for Salford. But following the Norman conquest of 1066, England was divvied up into smaller portions of land and handed out to supporters and sycophants of William the Conqueror. The Salford Hundred here was given over to an aristocrat called Roger de Poitou. De Poitou gave this bit here, the Manor of Manchester, to the de Grelly family. This is the first time this side of the riverbank was officially run by different people to this side, and it's stayed that way ever since. Now, as I've said 1,000 times, this whole area around here was a tiny little nowhere, barely significant for most of history, until suddenly it was. For a very bright and brief period, this place became one of the most important, or the most important on earth, and it all kick-started on the other side of the river over there in Manchester. Now, both places had grown big enough to be granted official markets by the 13th century, and both had a very strong economic base created by the wool trade. Immigrants of Flemish weavers came to the area and boosted the quality and quantity of textiles produced, mostly on the Manchester side of things. And Manchester also got a cathedral before Salford did. And it's around here that Manchester starts to peel away and grow a little faster than Salford. But the real kicker came in 1761 when the Duke of Bridgewater built a canal from his mines in Worsley, not directly into Salford to feed the workshops and mills popping up there, but he had it take this strange route here, crossing the Irwell in the south and driving up into Manchester instead. Now, this decision was a turning point for both towns. Salford could have easily gained from this pioneering industrial canal that would go on to inspire a network across the country. But the vision of that network is what made the Duke and his engineer James Brindley choose to create the canal basin in Manchester instead. Crossing the river meant that the canal could connect to future canals heading south where the rest of the country is. Ending in Salford would mean that the canal might sit in isolation and boats would have to use the rival River Mersey Navigation Company owned by someone else. The canal basin set up here meant a new economic centre of the region quickly grew. Manchester and Salford boomed, but it was the former that grew the quickest, spreading rapidly this way in comparison to Salford, which stayed bound to the riverside. Now, horrifyingly for Salford, the same thing happened again in 1830 when the Liverpool to Manchester Railway did exactly the same thing. It crossed the River Irwell here, behind me over there, and brought passengers into exactly the same area of Castlefield, choosing not to go with the easier option, which was just to stay here on the Salford side. Once again, Salford had been overlooked. Now what happened next was that Manchester boomed quicker than anywhere else, cradling the Industrial Revolution and drawing people in from all around the area to work in the mills and the factories and the warehouses and stuff like that. Now Salford was there alongside with it, but from now on, all eyes were on the other side of the river. Now, of course, that's a very brief explanation of why Manchester became more important than Salford, but Salford was still significant. It had its own town hall, its own cathedral, its own market, its own set of fine Georgian houses, and of course, it achieved city status eventually. But why was it never absorbed into Manchester? The reasons are complex and numerous, of course. Firstly, politically, Salford has its own powers, its own MP, and its own administrative people, aldermen, and later councillors, and none of those were willing to cede anything to Manchester, not least because it would have put them out of a job, or at least diminish their own influence. Secondly, it didn't need to be. Through industrialisation, Salford handled its own affairs pretty well. It boomed in its own way, spreading away from the river and absorbing its own districts. What was the point in merging? And thirdly, Salford and Manchester were just never rival cities, despite what many people think. Liverpool and Manchester had beef because of trade tariffs and whatnot, but Salford and Manchester just got on nicely. Industries on both sides of the divide worked well together. Most didn't even care where they fell under. If you could build boats, or haul coal, or make dye, or cut timber, then as long as you got a spot close to the action, the imaginary line down the water didn't really make a difference. Now, over the years, of course, there have been people who've wondered the same question: why hasn't Salford become part of Manchester, and would merging the two cities actually be a good thing? Now, mostly that's by rich industrialists over the years who had a vision for what the city could look like way off into a nice, shiny new future. But also today, you get a lot of people coming into the city who often wonder why it's just never happened. However, in 1976, most of the arguments were put to bed when the conurbation of Greater Manchester was created, putting not just Salford but other nearby satellite towns into the same vague administrative control and redrawing boundaries here and there. Now, this didn't make all of this Manchester's domain, but it did create an administrative region centred around the city. And even though not a lot of people really liked this at first, Greater Manchester has stuck around, and mostly it's accepted by people as a pretty good move. Now, while this didn't do anything to affect Salford's city status, of course, what it effectively did was made the wider Salford area come under an umbrella centred around Manchester. There are arguments both for and against merging. The first is administrative efficiency. Unified services like education, transport, and who collects the bins could be streamlined under one council, potentially leading to cost savings and less bureaucratic duplication, although often the term cost savings in this context means people being laid off, so... Secondly, it'd have a stronger economic brand. Manchester already has a stronger international brand than Salford. Absorbing Salford into Manchester would mean instantly growing the city, potentially boosting investment, tourism and business. Particularly places like Media City UK, firmly in Salford of course, but often confusingly referred to as Manchester by people not familiar with the whole Salford issue. Manchester absorbing Salford would mean the city growing by 97 square kilometres to become 213 square kilometres, making it twice as big as Birmingham, more than 4 times as big as Liverpool, and a third the size of London. Thirdly, integrated public planning. It would be easier to manage housing, infrastructure and economic development projects, let alone environmental issues. A good example of this is with the transport, which in recent years has seen most public transport in Greater Manchester become socialised under the same central control. It could also help reduce inequalities between the boroughs by allowing resources from wealthier Manchester to be spent on deprived areas of Salford. And fourthly, it's already mostly acting like a part of Manchester. As we saw in a previous video, the heavily built up part of Salford by the river already acts as a spillover of Manchester, full of apartments, hotels and nightlife.
The river divide here in 2025 might as well not be there at all. Over here, where Salford is more geographically distinct, the old town hall has been turned into flats. The cathedral draws very few visitors, and only the university really holds its own as a distinctive, separate place.
It sounds harsh, but it almost feels like Salford has given up trying to be a great city in its own right. Today it feels like a metropolitan area like any other town in Greater Manchester, but instead of having a defined town centre, it's just a very big urban sprawl with no real high street. I guess what I'm saying is it doesn't feel like you're in a city centre when you're in Salford. It doesn't feel distinctive. It does feel like you're on the outskirts of Manchester city centre. High-rise buildings give way to railway viaducts and modern warehouses and parks and small industry. Now you could say exactly the same for East Manchester. And that feeling is quite important. Salford doesn't feel different to Manchester. It feels like Manchester's left arm that's gone numb after being slept on for too long. I quite like that. Put that on your signpost. But I'm not from Salford. I'm looking at this as an outsider, and that feeling is just as important when you flip it the other way around.
Out of all the cons of merging these two cities, the first one to think about really is that there's something distinctive about the Salford identity. Salford has a long, proud history of doing its own thing, creating its own culture and media and poetry. It has its own heroes: James Jewell, L.S. Lowry, Mark Addy, Mike Lee, Sheila Delaney and Bez. And as we've seen, its history goes back to Saxon times, making it one of the oldest places in the region. It even has its own Peterloo-like moment. Back in 1931, when at the height of the Wall Street-inspired economic crash, 10,000 protesters turned out in front of the town hall here to oppose means testing to the dole. And like Peterloo over a century before, the peaceful protests were met by violent police officers who began attacking them, leading to an event known as the Battle of Bexley Square. The fact that few people have even heard of this says a lot about, well, first how little we're taught about working class history, but also how easy it is for a city like Salford to forget its own historic moments. Absorbing Salford into Manchester risks losing some of that history and that identity altogether. Secondly, there is political resistance to the move, like there always has been. The same reason Salford never became part of Manchester historically all kind of still count today. There's just no real need. And thirdly, often absorption like this can do the opposite than create equity across the area. It might actually end up benefiting the already wealthy Manchester city centre at the expense of some of Salford's most deprived areas. And if you don't think that makes sense, think of how many millions have been spent over the years on Manchester city centre while its own deprived neighbourhoods yearn for more. Money is influence, and there's no reason to believe that Salford's most deprived neighbourhoods would soon be swimming in Manchester's cash.
Now ultimately it might come down to that feeling of distinctiveness. There are many people who live and work across Salford today who would hate to be called Mancunians. And also, history has taught us, and it still teaches us even today in 2025, that if a people have their own proud history and heritage, they should probably be allowed to manage their own affairs. And the fact of the matter is that both Manchester and Salford have both contributed more than their fair share to history, to shaping the way the world is today. They're both punching well above the weight, whether that's scientifically, culturally, or politically.
In the future, it may be inevitable that the two do just merge, either into a dominant Manchester or a weird new entity altogether. New Manchester? New Salford? Salchester anyone? Manford? Irwellville? Or maybe just one of them horrible places that sticks a hyphen in the middle?
So the truth is, it's just a very bad idea. Salford is a proud city with its own long history. There's not really enough to gain from the endeavour to even bother changing the road signs and the letterheads, let alone navigating the ethical quandary of erasing an entire city off the map. So yeah, let me know what you think about all this in the comments. I'm sure there's some very strong opinions out there, and I know it's a bit of a silly one, but I love thought experiments like this. And to be honest, there aren't that many twin cities around the world. Usually when people talk about twin cities, they talk about cities like in China, where you see two which are a certain distance apart that have just merged out of growth and conglomeration, and that's a twin city. But it's extremely rare to have twin cities that were born on opposite sides of the same river, head to head. Salford and Manchester are almost unique. Oh, Vina. Oh. You've been so patient the entire time, haven't you? What do you think? Salford or Manchester? Food? No. Oh.